Hello, I'm Matt Carpenter, and this is the Good Life Podcast. Hello, glad you are here to join us today on the Good Life Podcast. I am Matt Carpenter, and I'm grateful today to have Dr. Michael Connolly. Dr. Connolly is a history professor at Purdue University Northwest in Indiana. He has a PhD from the Catholic University of America, and he specializes in some of the history of New England. He has written one book called Capitalism, Politics, and Railroads in Jacksonian New England, and he's written for several other historical publications. But Dr. Connolly, we are very grateful to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's a pleasure.
Today, I wanted to talk about a topic that's not often discussed in the United States, at least. And Dr. Connolly has written several articles at the American Conservative on this topic, and that is the topic of Toryism. Now, for some Americans, when they hear that, especially for us in the South, that gives an immediate projection of the loyalists in, the American loyalists in the War for Independence. So there's some natural aversion to that. But just for starters, tell us, who are the Tories? What is a Tory? And I know that one could write books on that. So just tell us a brief introduction to Toryism.
One quick correction. The essays are in imaginative conservative, not American conservative. I want to make sure.
Excuse me.
That's
Thank
fine.
you for that.
We want to send people in the right direction to.
Yes. And I will, I do appreciate that. I will put a link to all those articles, in or on the podcast page. So I do appreciate that correction.
So Toryism, it's a slippery term depending on how you want to date it, its beginning. But in many ways, it dates from the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, where you have the abdication or the deposition of King James II off of the British throne. And people's attitude towards 1688, whether you were in favor of the removal of James or opposed to it, it divided British politics from that moment on. And generally speaking, sort of put it in simple terms, those who were more supportive of James II and the Stuarts' claim to the throne were eventually called Tories and took on that label. It originally began as sort of a pejorative, which often happens. Labels of groups or political parties, they begin as, some cruel term that's used to refer to them. And then the people to whom the term is applied eventually out of spite take it on and say, yes, you're right, that's exactly what I am. And so Tory was a Gaelic term which meant kind of like Irish bandits, Irish robbers. And with a last name like Connolly, I sort of appreciate that.
Yes.
That but those who were supportive of James took on this label of Tory, and those who were in favor of the Glorious Revolution, of course, Tories would never call it glorious, they call it the Inglorious Revolution.
Right.
Those who were opposed to James began to take on eventually the name of Whig. And that's in many ways the origin of the British political party system. And even today, we still call the British Conservative Party by that term, but sort of informally, they're still known as the Tory Party. And you're right, in the Revolution, still to this day, you hear the two sides sort of divided up between patriots on one side and Tories on the other, and Tory is just another term for loyalist. But in many ways, that's incorrect. I'm not the first person to say this. Other historians have remarked that you didn't have a battle between Whigs and Tories, or patriots and Tories. What you had was a battle between revolutionary Whigs and loyalist Whigs, and there weren't that many Tories who were hanging around the United States in the 1760s and 1770s. But anyhow, the origin of it really dates to around the time of the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89.
Okay. So from that, is it possible to trace? And I don't want to dig too far in this. This is somewhat maybe historian inside baseball, so I don't want to spend too much time. But I know, in that same century, 1688, but prior to it, you had the English Civil War
Mm-hmm.
between the Puritans and the Cavaliers. So was that in some ways, and I know this is a debated topic, but is that a precursor to what we see later on in 1688? At least what is your perspective? With the Puritans representing the Whig side and the Cavaliers representing the Tory side.
Yeah, that's not an unfair way to look at it. You can see sort of precursors to the division that comes after 1688 in the divisions that come between the English Civil War in the 1640s, which of course leads to the execution of Charles I, and then through the interregnum into Charles II. You can see those divisions between those who were much more supportive of the claims of the Stuarts to the throne and those who were much more skeptical, not only of the claims, but of Stuart policies, those in the early part, of course, following the Puritans and Cromwellians, and then later on opposition to, in particular, James II, right? Things come to a head at that point.
Right.
But the divisions that you see, sure, you can see echoes of it earlier on, sure.
I know there was a book several years ago that came out by, and I'll probably miss his name, but Steve Pincus, Pincus, called 1688, The First Modern Revolution. Are you familiar with that?
I am generally. I looked at it for the project that I'm working on now, the book that I'm hoping to see, it will be coming out in the fall. I did refer to it a little bit there. He speaks quite a bit, if I recall correctly, about James II.
Right.
For example, again, you don't want to go too far into the weeds here, but saying things like James II wanted to um, emulate the French in some ways and create a French style centralized government along Catholic continental models. And of course, this is going to set everybody alight
Sure.
um, and lead to at least some of the energy behind his deposition in 1688-89. Wow.
Okay. Well, it's been years since I referred to it, but that was the first exposure I ever had as a high school teacher to any position that cast 1688 as in any way, a negative thing. Now, again, it depends on your perspective. Some people say that revolutions are not negative, but we'll talk about that. So, when you have the Tories who come along after 1688 who are more loyal to the crown. So, how would you then contrast? Right now, you have a Tory party in
Mhm.
Britain. One can argue whether or not they actually reflect true Tory sentiments. But so, how would you contrast, though, for Americans? You're in America. You live here.
Mhm.
The modern conservatism with what it means to be a Tory, not in the ongoing British political party sense, but just in the older Tory sense.
Right. That's been kind of the one of the themes that I've been sort of drumming on in some of the articles is to draw some of that contrast, not in both Britain and America in some ways. That yes, Toryism is often, I mean, it's a byword today for conservatism, and it was at that time seen as being a more conservative philosophy, way of life, or attitude of the mind, or something like that as well. But the conservatism that we see often talked about today, that we're just familiar with in a political sense, contrasting it with Toryism in the 18th, in particular 19th centuries, is a completely different sensibility. The Particularly in the United States, that conservatism in the United States is at its heart much more liberal in the way that it speaks about things, how it thinks about things, much more liberal in its philosophy, if you will, because if you listen to conservatives today, many will use terms like individualism, and they'll base decisions on the power of individuals, the freedom of individuals to do what they wish, free from government control. The foundation of everything is not society. The foundation of everything is individuals who then create social institutions, who then create governments, the state, and so on. It's a conservatives speak in contemporary American conservatives speak in very liberal language, as opposed to Tories, of which you can find American Tories. It's that's one of my projects, is to go and identify these people,
Mm-hmm.
because I want to bring to life a sort of counter tradition, if you will. We can get into this, but this comes into a very famous author named Lewis Hartz in the 1950s, speaking of the
Right.
liberal tradition in America, and that's sort of animating me too. But Tories have a different sensibility. I would argue much more Aristotelian, Thomistic, if you will, and that is the foundation of things is society, social institutions, families, so familial institutions, church, and what have you, and the identity of individuals, the context of individuals, the education of individuals, what have you, comes from those things. So it's much more of I kind of hesitate to use the term because it can be taken the wrong way, but a much more communitarian
Yes.
sensibility as opposed to an individualist sensibility. And in the United States today, you really have in some ways, two sets of liberals arguing with each other, left liberals and right liberals, and Tories don't fit into that model. They consider and understand life very differently.
So some of that, it sounds like, it has to do with, and I was thinking we'd get into this later, but it's a good time to talk about it now, is the view of history that those who are liberal or Whig, I
Mm-hmm.
know, that you've written about in the imaginative conservative. Uh, you've written about Herbert Butterfield's book, The
Right.
Whig View of History, which I remember reading probably 3 years ago for the first time, although I'd seen it referred to quite a bit. And you offer some really good critiques, but there's the Whig view, and then there is the Tory view. I can't. Maybe there's a better way to say it. I can't think of it though. When it comes to history, so help us understand. For the average layman, what is the difference between a Whig view of history and a Tory view?
So the way I describe this, you'll immediately recognize it because it's still current today. The way people understand history and the Whig interpretation of history, it's a clumsy term. It's very academic, and people say, "What are you talking about?" But once you get into the details, people will, "Well, that's right. I recognize that type of thing." So Herbert Butterfield, 1931, wrote the tiny little book. It's a slender volume. I don't even know if it makes 100 pages. Still in print today, called The Whig Interpretation of History, and it was something of a complaint. And in this, Butterfield is saying there was this group of historians that in the 19th century in particular, but they're still around today, their legacy, their way of looking at things. But what they did was write about history, create this narrative where all history ends up with them. It ends with them, it complements them. All of history essentially is progressive. And I don't mean that in a political sense, I mean that in quite a literal
Right,
lowercase p sense. Progressive in that it progresses to them
right,
in their view of the world and very particular views on liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, all those type of things. And it ends with them, and by doing so, it's them lacking humility. And this is Butterfield talking, lacking humility, saying all history ends with me. I'm up on this promenade. I'm looking over all of history. It was this particular way of creating a narrative and looking at history that said this process was inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it. History is rising to me, the Whig. It's not rising to you, the Tory. In fact, you're fighting against it. You're sort of delaying the inevitable progress that we're experiencing. And because of that, it was kind of this type of history is almost a type of psychological warfare. Look, it's inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it. Just don't stop fighting what's inevitable. And if you get that message all the time, finally you say, well, okay, so I'm not going to fight it. It's going to happen anyway. It's inevitable. Uh, Whig history was also, as Butterfield spoke of it, extremely simplistic. It was this sort of uh, very simplistic message of liberty and equality and so on, rising to this point. Any sort of contradiction to it, of course, history is very complex, and there's lots of details and complexities and contradictions. Those were left to the wayside. And so history, as the Whigs described it, was this very sort of simple narrative of progress that was leading to Whigs/liberals and their ideas. History was moving away from those who would oppose it, like Tories or something like that. Um, and by doing so, of course, it delegitimizes opposition, because if you capture the historical narrative like that, and you're the one writing popular history books, as the people like Thomas Babington Macaulay and Lord Acton and others are doing, you capture the historical sensibility and understanding of a people. It's very difficult to dislodge that. And when you start challenging it and making claims against it, it's very difficult to do, because you've been delegitimized. Your counter narrative has been delegitimized by the history that has been created. So Butterfield complained about this and said this is an extremely simple, progressive story of history, the ultimate point of which is to flatter the present. You are better than the people and institutions and things that happened in the past, right? History is the story of progress from authority to greater liberty, and things are getting better all the time. And sure, there's a hiccup here and there by people who won't get on board, but it's going in this direction, and there's nothing you can do about it.
So when you consider, though, the and I'm not saying that only wicked people have that view. So that's not what I'm about to say, all right? But if you consider the evil that has been done in the name of helping others get on board, for lack of a better way to say, Rousseau, when he talks about the general will, he talks
Mm-hmm.
about those who will not, abide with the general will, and how they need to be helped in, in some of the measures that he talks about, how any who stand athwart the general will need to be, I can't remember the term that he uses, but essentially they need to be
Right.
brought to
They
bear.
need to be made. They need to be. I'll put this in the creepiest authoritarian language that I can, but they need to be made to understood that they are laboring under a misapprehension. How about that?
That's a wonderful way to say it, and that's you betray your family's European roots when you
There
say
you
it
go.
that way, but because it almost sounds believable when you put it like that.
I've
But
convinced you. That's what it is.
this was the philosophy of the French Revolution. I mean, and you can, without me going into all the different revolutions, this is what the revolutionaries argued in every case,
Right.
that we are moving towards greater freedom. Now, whether or not that freedom is actually accomplished in the end is a totally other question.
Hmm.
But the argument for movement is the argument of we're going from, you know, in a secular way of speaking, glory to glory.
Right. I mean, history is only moving in one direction. Right. That's the way that that's the way that it goes. The importance of this, the importance of and this, he doesn't emphasize this enough. Butterfield, I mean, the importance of this is to demonstrate that historiography is important,
Yes,
right? Historiography meaning the history of history, what historians have said over time. And if you can capture the historiography and come up with a compelling narrative that in a total way explains why history has occurred, how it's gotten to this point. And if you can do this in a very understandable and simple way, it is extremely powerful. And this is what I mean in the essay that I wrote on historiography, that in its power, it can delegitimize opposition to it. And
right.
that can be dangerous. It can be. The reactions to that can be from the very subtle to the diabolical in some ways.
Yes, and in both world wars, I know from reading the literature of and the propaganda, not just from the politicians, but even sadly from the pulpits of many churches, both the Allied and in the Central Powers in World War One, then the Axis
Mhm.
in World War Two. Both both sides adopted a Whiggish view, a sense of we are going to triumph because we are on the right side of history.
It's
And
powerful,
yes,
right? Very,
yes,
very powerful.
and we're dealing with that right now. I mean, I can't think of how many times I've heard people say that we being those who hold to traditional perspectives on morality and theology and things, we're on the wrong side of history.
Right, exactly.
So so it's but to contrast that, though, there is this Tory view, which granted is not nearly as alluring as the progressive view of
Right.
history, but takes a lot more into account. So tell us, what is the Tory view? And if there's a better name for it, feel free to say what that is. But what is the Tory view of history?
No, and I use the word Tory interpretation of history as a direct contrast to it. And by the way, there was such a thing as a Tory interpretation of history. So if you go back and you look in the years directly after 1688, where you have British commentators and historians trying to deal with the reality of what just happened and frankly, trying to capture the narrative to describe what has just happened in the glorious revolution of 1688, you see a Tory response to this. Those who aren't all that keen on what happened in 1688 and 89 and are fashioning a response to an emerging Whig interpretation, which is, as I just described it, it leads Butterfield to write his book in 1931. The Tory interpretation is really, the way I always describe it is, it comes down to three things. Here's me simplifying it. I'm hopefully not simplifying it too much, but three things to keep in mind. Tories, when they look at history, say that history is quite complex. It's complex, it's chaotic, sometimes contradictory, it's very elaborate. And that a Tory historian practicing their craft will communicate that it is messy. Doing history, understanding history is messy. It's not this sort of simplified story of black hats and white hats as if it's a Western. It's much more complex and messy than that. So elaboration
Right.
is the first characteristic of Tory history. The second is etymology. I always call it the three E's. I tell my students this. There's the three E's to keep in mind. The second being etymology. The meaning of words will change over time. And so a word like, I don't know, liberty or equality or something like that, when it's spoken in 1688 or 1720 or whatever, it's not going to mean the same thing by 1950 or 2022. It's going to shift over time. And if you bring contemporary understandings, etymological understanding of words from the date and time where you're writing and project them back on the past, you're going to misunderstand and essentially misunderstand a lot of the messiness and the chaos that we were just talking about. You'll be projecting the meaning of words on the past
Right.
and missing much of the meaning that's there. And the third rather, of the three E's is empathy, and that is even if you fundamentally disagree going in with the person, the event, whatever it is you're looking at, it's always best to proceed with an empathetic point of view, sort of living vicariously through the person. Again, not because you agree, but because what you want to do is get in their shoes, get inside their head. Why are they doing, thinking, saying these particular things? don't start from a point of view of animosity, because that will warp things a little bit too. Start from a point of view of empathy, and Tory, and you can sort of get it from these three E's. Tories tended to like to write their history in the form of biography, not in sort of sweeping narratives that are describing particular political values or particular philosophies, right? A bloodless history, as a professor of mine used to say. You don't want to write bloodless history where it's all just a history of movements.
Right.
Tories tend to, and this is a reflection of their philosophy, seeing families, seeing people coming from a context, institutions and the like. They want to talk about people, individual people, the lives they lived in, the context that they came out of, communities, what have you. And so that biography, in many ways, is a reflection of the Tory interpretation of history, and using those three E's, and it is very different from the Whig interpretation of history. It's just so easy to say, and lacking completely in humility, by the way, that say all history leads to me. You
Right.
must feel really wonderful about yourself if you believe all history leads to you. And Tories will reply and say, you know what, it's a little bit more complex than that.
Right. And I remember one of my students years ago, at one point, he said, Mr. Carpenter, why, when every time we ask a question, do you say it's complicated?
Right.
And it's not that, whenever they would have a history question, I would say, you can't merely adopt they're always wrong and we're always right perspective. They have reasons for doing what they're doing. So, and even now, I'm not a professor, certainly, so I can say this, and you may disagree, and that's fine. But the general idea, even of a textbook, having a textbook that has that lumps history, I mean, chronologically, that's understandable, but based on movements, based on patterns of behavior, or political ideologies, that just seems like a more a Whiggish view of presenting history than actually just using primary sources and biography and speeches. That again, that's it's an observation. It's not something I've developed thoroughly, but it seems like textbooks, at least the modern ones, strive for that bloodlessness to a degree. So anyway, that's just
I mean, I would say that they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, you can talk about romanticism, you can talk about the age of nationalism
right.
within that. I mean, because there are such things. I mean, we
Sure.
use periodization all the time, and I don't have a problem with that. It's a way to interpret and understand history, but they're not mutually exclusive. You can have a discussion of romanticism and nationalism, what have you, and have within that a discussion of the lives of people and
Right.
the world that they experience. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Okay.
Um, the Some of the problems I have with textbooks is that they they pretty much have this. They say the same thing. I mean, it's just essentially a very similar narrative. The difference is one of shade rather than of type. Um,
Yes.
and there are the good ones and bad ones, but that's generally my problem with them. It's just I feel like I'm reading variations on a theme. They really don't tend to tell you something remarkably different between them.
So after the Glorious Revolution, we have new monarchs who arrive, and then eventually the Hanoverians come, and so they continue, and then eventually the United States or the colonies break away. What happened to Toryism in America, or in North America, not just the United States, but in North America after the War for Independence?
Well, many people. I mean, as I mentioned before, and I'm inclined to agree with this, that the American Revolution, the majority of it were of people who were between liberals. It was between revolutionary liberals and a lot of loyalist liberals. Now, that's not to say there weren't Tories. Many Tories, people who had this particular philosophy of attitude of mind that I'm talking of, some stayed, but many left, right? Many will go to Canada. And the legacy of American loyalists going to Canada has a major impact in the shaping of the political culture of Canada. A much stronger Tory tradition in Canada than is certainly emphasized in the United States. It's not that there isn't one in the United States, but it's underemphasized, and it's much more in place in a country like Canada. So, in the years after the Revolution, you do see very slowly the development, or maybe a redevelopment, of a Tory tradition or a Tory sensibility in the United States, but it comes with distance from the Revolution. When you begin to see institutions having some age on them, when you begin to see the country having some age on it, when you begin to see the original founding generation die and you have a new generation rising, you begin to see more of a Tory sensibility rising among some American politicians, American writers, along the lines that I spoke of before. Not an Toryism isn't ideological. It's not even something so strict as a political philosophy, but it's a sort of attitude of mind about the imperfectibility of human beings. Right? You're not dealing with a perfectible humanity or anything like that. An appreciation of the necessity of strong, lasting institutions that help frame life, the danger of class consciousness, and how heightened class consciousness can actually erode community and could have a role in ripping down the aforementioned institutions. You begin to see this starting to develop the further away you start to get from the Revolution. In the antebellum period, and then really throughout the 19th century, which is where I feel most comfortable, since that's where I do most of my writing. That's when you see the Richard Henry Dana seniors beginning to complain, write and say that I don't like the way things are going here. This new Jacksonian era has a different ethos. I think it's a destructive ethos, and he's just one example. There are others, Ralph Adams Cram, the well-known architect at the end of the century. People like that. You can even detect Tory sensibilities in people like Daniel Webster, who in many ways you can describe him as being a liberal, but you begin to see Tory sensibilities coming into some of his rhetoric. People like Rufus Choate, very famous lawyer, a U.S. senator, great admirer of Webster. Who else? James Russell Lowell, very famous poet, and so on. I'm not just going to rattle off names. But you begin to see this sensibility coming in, particularly in the 19th century, as a sort of pushback to some of what they're beginning to detect in the Jacksonian era and beyond. Yeah.
So, with that emphasis, is there a particular region? Was it stronger in New England? Because I know New England was a bastion of federalism, up the Federalist Party and everything. Was it stronger there, or does it defy geographical boundaries, or is there a way to trace that at all?
As a general rule, I think Toryism finds more of a home in areas with a deeper sense of history, with older institutions, if you will. And so you can find, how do I put this? You're in Alabama. I have to be careful how I put this. There is
That's
such a
all
thing
right. Go for
as
it.
Southern Toryism. In fact, if you've read Russell Kirk's Conservative Mind, right?
Right.
Russell Kirk always described himself as a bohemian Tory. And if you read Conservative Mind, there's, you can see that he identifies this Tory mentality in the Southern tradition. He's very much in love with John Randolph of Roanoke, for example, wrote a book
Right.
Randolph of Roanoke. He sees that Tory sensibility with deep roots in the South. And when he discusses people from New England, when he discusses, in particular, people like John Quincy Adams, James Russell Lowell, he speaks of him, to a degree, Nathaniel Hawthorne, people like that. He sees in them ambivalence, meaning they're not fully Tory that you would be able to see on somebody like John Randolph of Roanoke. Ambivalence in the sense of they talk Tory language, but the
Right.
reality is on the other side, they don't seem to be all that critical of emerging modernity. They don't seem to be
Right.
all that critical of the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, some of these people are getting quite wealthy off of the emerging Industrial Revolution. So there's a sort of torn nature of New England uh, Toryism. And some of what I'm trying to do, if you notice, there's sort of like a theme, geographical theme, developing with what I do, and that is in a way sort of pushing back at Kirk a little bit and saying that you can find a Tory tradition in New England letters, and I think it's valuable to uncover that because there are things to be learned, and there are some very interesting pieces to read, people to understand in that New England conservative tradition that I think will strengthen that tradition in many ways and make it less sectional and more national. So it can be found everywhere, but in areas with very deep historic roots, I think, institutional roots.
One of my favorite articles or essays written by the Southern agrarian Donald Davidson in his
Mhm.
book "Still Rebels, Still Yankees."
I know exactly where you're going.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, he talks about this very thing. Because Davidson loved the South. He was a loyal son of the South. But he talked about when he would go to Vermont because he
Yep.
taught at the Breadloaf School there in the summer, and how looking at Vermont made him. I think he says it made me almost want to be from here. Almost,
Shocking.
yeah. But he what he loved though was that communitarian, decentralized, organic view of society that he found there. If I could go back to one period in history, I have about 15 that I would like to visit. But one of them is I would love to visit or to be a fly on the wall at least when Donald Davidson would visit Robert Frost and they would
Mm.
talk together. I mean, because on one hand, you think, how in the world could someone from the deep South with loyalties there and someone from New England get along? But these two men, they saw society largely the same way.
And Frost was a very conservative fellow. You know, when he was asked, I'm trying to remember the context. I think it was late in his life, probably during around the time of Kennedy. You know, what kind of Democrat are you? And he said, I was a Grover Cleveland Democrat. Well, that
Yes,
tells you quite a bit of.
yes,
He was not a great admirer of the New Deal. He had that sort of Yankee flintiness, right? That's always
yes,
the word that's used with Yankees in Northeast, flinty. Um, that he didn't like the New Deal. The government was starting to do things that communities and families would do in the past, and so on. So I doesn't surprise me at all in some ways that Frost and Davidson could sit down and find so much to agree on. They came from different sections, but from very similar perceptions of the world, very similar philosophical backgrounds.
yes. Their geographic differences were nothing compared to their, if I could say, their metaphysical
Yeah.
similarities. They saw the world the same way. And that's really the type of thing I've been looking forward to bringing out, in talking with you about this, because the organic way of looking at life, not as an ideologue, but as a human being made in the image of God, fallen with original sin, but still one among many others who if you look at this world realistically, you're actually capable of doing much more than if you come in with a plan to fix everybody and everything. And that seems like what a Tory view is.
Yeah, taking people where they are and beginning there, understanding the context of where they're living, the community, family, and what have you. Very practical in some senses, non-ideological is what I mean by that. But also honoring that, honoring having a sensitivity and seeing almost a sacredness in that, if you will. Um, and not coming in there and trying to tear it down and tinker and engineer and things like that. Dealing with people the way they are, rather than the way that you would really like them to be. I
Right.
think that's true. Yeah, and
You mentioned. Go ahead.
you got me thinking about Davidson now. I have all these things that are going. This could go on for about 3 hours if I'm going to chat. But Davidson had great admiration for this Yankee farmer. I think,
Yes.
if I remember correctly, he speaks of the typical Yankee farmer in Vermont, and it belies. This gets back to this Tory idea of complexity, right? As opposed to the Whig tendency to deal with this very streamlined, simplistic, overly thematic presentation of history. It would be like saying, if you want to understand New England, go to Boston. Or if you want to understand the South, go to Atlanta. I mean, obviously that's not the case. And you can see that being elaborated in somebody like Davidson going up to Vermont, which is about as far away a place from, you would think, that Davidson would ever be comfortable. And he goes up there and he finds a second home.
Yes. It totally delights in the place.
Yep.
So, that leads to, you mentioned this, and it drew me to John W. Osborne's article in Modern Age from 1984, where he talks about, I mean, I think it's just titled Toryism,
It
but he
is.
calls Toryism a way of life, which I think is just a beautiful philosophy. Now, that can sound scary if you think, oh no, political ideology has to be a way of life. But this is not political ideology, though.
Not at all.
So you know, I know we've already covered some of this, but when he calls it a way of life, differentiate the way of life he's talking about from everyone having to do the equivalent of walking in North Korean high step as a soldier.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's not you don't go and find the Tory Little Red Book, right? That tells you that you live this way, this is exactly the way it is. It's not that. It's a sensitivity, if you will, an attitude of mind, a sort of intuition or almost inclination that is, well, it's everything that we've said so far. In some ways, it's very practical. It's taking people where they are. It's understanding the institutions through which people live, and probably most important, because this pops in my mind as well. There's a joyousness to it.
Oh
You know,
boy.
Tories are not. It may go counter to what people think. Are not sort of dour type saying you're living a miserable life. Please change it, and
Right.
the world is going right down the tubes, and everything is terrible. Quite the opposite. Tories tend to take a great joy in the place they're in. They tend their garden. They enjoy the day. They enjoy the company of friends. In fact, I was thinking of it driving in today. Hilaire Belloc. I forget where this is, but it's in my mind, and it makes me think of how a Tory would see things. But one of his poems, "Wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there's always laughter and good red wine." Well, you could
Hmm.
substitute Tory in there for Catholic, and it would be just as good. It's this sort of attitude of life, of appreciating place, loving institutions that you grew up with, caring for them, preserving them, passing them on, in a Burkean sense almost.
Yes.
Um, but Yeah, I guess that's how I describe it. It's very much a sensitivity to place. It's not a political platform or anything like that. And it goes for the environment too. A sensitivity to the environment, a sense of stewardship to the environment, things like that. An
Right.
entirely different sensibility than you'd find with, say, Whigs or liberals.
Well, I was just about to ask. So for me, really, one of the books that's been instrumental for me in changing my outlook, and my outlook was already changing some, but then when I came to acquire this book, it was it was thrilling. That's the best way I know how to say it. The Tory View of Landscape.
Yes.
That that perspective, as a one who's raised in the South with it, granted a right liberal slash libertarian view of the environment. As I've gotten older, I've come to see there's a lot of problems with that. But I did not know, outside of Sir Roger Scruton, I did not know of many who act, on, for lack of a better way to put it, and I don't like it to say, but our side, essentially, that's the best way I can say it.
I know what you mean.
People who hold to traditional good things, who take this, but then this book talks about an entire group of people who love the land. So go ahead.
It's a marvelous book. I mean, it was a revelation to me. I stumbled upon that relatively recently as well. In fact, not too long before I wrote this article. It was one of the stimuli to writing the article, because you can sort of imagine it. And I'm being slightly sarcastic here, but you'll get the point. That a Whig garden, everything will be exactly in place,
Yes,
right? If
yes.
you go to the Whig's house and there's a big garden in the back, every flower will be precisely placed. Every vegetable, it'll be very, very neat, almost creepy in its neatness. And if you go to a Tory garden, typical English garden, it's not a mess, but it's this bewildering diversity, wonderful diversity of things and
Yes.
colors. It's actually shying away from too much organization in this, because too much organization is this sort of inauthentic. It's fake. There's nothing organic about that. It's just a marvelous observation that you see coming out of that book. I love it.
Yes, so we live in Huntsville, which Alabama, which is dominant. Well, Athens, which is next to Huntsville. Huntsville is dominant with engineers. So
Mm.
there's a lot of precision here. So in reading the description that's presented in that book, I just think about walking into a place where there is just this almost almost like an ordered explosion of beauty and goodness and nourishing things that are there in the midst of ponds and beehives, and it's all of it, like when God gave us creation. It was very good, and something for man to tend, but not something for him to exercise domination over, but stewardship.
Exactly.
So now, one of the things mentioned, and you talk about this in your article, and it's mentioned also in the book we just mentioned, the Tory View of Landscape, but that is a group who is often who's often dealt a poor hand, and that is the English Romantic poets.
Hmm.
They are treated, at least in a lot of the literature from conservatives, as you know liberals, quasi totalitarians, and granted, many of them started their lives as radicals, but there's also quite a few of them: Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, who were very, they were conservative, they were faithful. So tell us, how can one be both romantic and a Tory?
That's a good question. There is sort of a division, if you will, on how Tory slash, I got to be careful I'm not too loose in my language. I was going to say Tory slash conservatives, and how they look at romanticism, because there is some suspicion of it. right? There is some
Sure.
suspicion of romanticism because romanticism seems to put a great deal of emphasis upon the individual creativity, expressing him or herself, and very emotional and passionate, as opposed to, okay, calm, reason, let's work our way through this. And so many conservatives will be suspicious of the sort of subjectivism that they can see um, coming out of the Romantic movement. But you can, Romanticism gave, uh, how do I put this? It gave much to conservatism. You can see that in how Wordsworth developed over his life, beginning Coleridge too. They're so enthusiastic about the French Revolution. And towards the end of their lives, it's much different. They're now beginning to see things more organically.
Yes.
The relationship of communities and institutions and people and churches and what have you, and seeing things as a working whole, as opposed to breaking that up into compartments and what have you. But yes, you can see a conservative or Tory sensibility in Romanticism. You see it definitely in the poetry of somebody like Wordsworth, right? When he's I'm trying to remember the name of the railroad, but his famous poem where he's talking about the devastation that railroads are making on the English countryside,
Right.
affecting deteriorating it essentially, and tearing down these beautiful landscapes, which are a gift from God. And what these railroads are doing, they're just solely in the interest of money and spreading a market society that's more interested in developing the economy than it is developing a sense of beauty. So yes, you can see very definitely a Tory sensibility in Romanticism. But you're right. There's a division within conservative thought about whether Romanticism is a period to be celebrated or or criticized. No question.
And I'm not saying that every romantic poet is a conservative or a Tory.
Right.
I certainly not. But those three especially. I mean, when I read Wordsworth's ecclesiastical sonnets,
Hmm.
his his sonnet on what a pastor or a priest should be is for me the highlight. I mean, the best summation that I can think of what a priest or a pastor should look like. It talks about him taking out his sword and about the bold strength with which he preaches. He ascends the pulpit looking, appearing somewhat minimal, but he and I'm not quoting this precisely, but just his description is wonderful, and that's just one poem, and he has an entire line of all these sonnets that when you read them, this man did not hate the church. Someone could not hate the church who would write so gloriously about her.
Yeah, I mean, you see through his and their works an attempt to preserve the good and the beautiful and the true, and they're seeing what's arriving with the Industrial Revolution, with modernity, and to a degree some nationalism and the like. It is not interested in those things, and is beginning to erode them, and so they are writing to preserve, the good, the beautiful, and the true in Wordsworth in the English countryside. Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Absolutely right. You can see that in Dana too. I mean, just to bring it back to poor old Richard Henry Dana Sr. I mean, he was a great advocate for Romanticism. He was an
right?
exponent of it, but he also understood, as he was writing, that they're taken to excess. Romanticism holds within itself danger,
Yes,
right? This excessive sense of self can actually erode the very things that some romantics are trying to preserve. It
yes.
becomes sort of a nihilistic come the end. It becomes something meaningless because you become so self-absorbed. And so, he was trying to balance those things. Yeah.
And that's part of this mentality is the understanding that you need to balance you cannot give yourself totally to being reactionary, and neither can you be one who wants to only move forward. So the last thing I want to talk about, and we actually did not get to. I mean, your first book, I was not able to. I will confess, I was not able to acquire it before we had the interview. So I read some of the reviews on it, which is an interesting take, and I enjoyed it on the railroads and the different perspectives on the railroads in New England. But I'd like to hear though about the church. What as Americans we are so accustomed to the division of church and state. We think that that is the great gift that we have bestowed upon modernity is we led the way for this. But the Tories did not have precisely the same view. I'm not saying that every Tory is a strict establishmentarian, but what is the Tory view towards the church?
Well, certainly Anglican high Tories believed, in Britain, I'm speaking here now, believed in the necessity of and the ultimate good of having an established church. I mean, they understood things as crown and church. They understood those things together as being the foundation of English nationality and the foundation of political virtue that it was going to be coming from that. But not all Tories. Certainly there were Catholic Tories as well, and in the United States you'll find Tories of many different denominations, and not all of them were necessarily believing in an established church. However, they certainly would have believed in the necessity of religion and its role in creating a virtuous citizenry, that you couldn't have a healthy, I'll speak in American terms here, you couldn't have a healthy republic if you had citizens who were distant from virtue, had no understanding of virtue, or who had a blizzard of different ways to think about what virtue actually was. I mean, I think of someone like John Adams, or even John Quincy Adams, too. We don't want to go too far here and turn them into 100% Tories, but you can sense some of that in some of that concern about what a republic would look like if it no longer had the presence of religion in people like the Adams, father and son, and even beyond. You see
Yes,
with Henry,
I was about to say Henry Adams also.
Henry Adams as well, and Mont Saint Michel and Chartres and things like that. That the stable republics are built upon a virtuous citizenry. If you don't have a virtuous citizenry, republics fall apart, and something else takes their place, some sort of Caesarist regime or something like that. So if you want to maintain the republic, don't end up like what we see in the classical history, you need to have a virtuous citizenry. One of the most important institutions in inculcating that virtue are healthy churches. They weren't saying it has to be the Congregational Church or it has to be the Episcopal Church or something like that, but a virtuous citizenry that had a healthy religious culture, if you will. Yeah, and I should mention, by the way, you made me think of it when you were talking about church establishments. Remember, down into the antebellum period, some states had recognized publicly funded churches. Remember,
Right.
Massachusetts actually had to revise its constitution in the 1820s to disestablish a state church, which is what essentially it was. You see that in other states as well. So on the state level, you did have some establishments. On the federal level, of course not.
Right. And I think there was a book, and I cannot think of the name of it right now, but that was on the Anglicanism in Virginia in the
Mm-hmm.
uh, just before the Revolution,
Yeah.
which was, I mean, it presents with warts, but in general, a view of life in Virginia that was holistic, where you, I mean, you had the church was responsible that they took, yes, tax money went to the church, but they didn't just pay pastors an exorbitant salary and say everybody else just has to deal with life. The church was responsible to be the societal welfare agency. So they took some of that tithe money and they would distribute it to those who had medical needs, who had the needs for food and things like that. So they were responsible for administering a lot of these things that we just attribute to today, the national or state governments.
Absolutely. The church, all churches really, have the biggest social service network in the world, certainly previous to the two governments getting involved with various welfare policies and the like. The biggest social service offerers in the world, no question.
Yes.
No question about it. And that idea of this sort of, you use the word, I think, holistic, sort of seamlessness of it, if you will, this organic vision. It gets back to another Tory theme, and that is, and what we were just talking about with virtue, that the internal and the external have to match, if
Yes.
you will. If you have a virtuous citizenry, meaning internally here, you will have a virtuous republic, external. When there is a mismatch between the two, you can't compartmentalize them,
Right.
because you won't survive. They won't be healthy. There has to be a match between the internal and the external. A virtuous citizenry means a virtuous public sphere, and having healthy churches was key to that. Key to that health, that social health, and you hear Tories emphasizing that all the time.
Yes. Well, Dr. Connolly, I really appreciate you taking time to talk today. This has been a subject that I frankly don't know of many people that I can talk about this with.
Well, we just scratched the surface. There's so much more to talk about.
There is that. Well, so after I know you have another book coming out in time, which will likely deal with hopefully some of the things that we've discussed
I'll give you a
later on.
30-second preview of coming attractions,
Oh,
if I
please
can.
do. That's great.
So it's related, but not directly. So the book is about Jacobitism in late 19th century and early 20th century United Kingdom and the United States.
Oh, man.
There was a resurgent Jacobite movement around the time of late Victorian England and the United States. And these Jacobites considered themselves to be Tory revolutionaries. And so it discusses that on both sides of the Atlantic. So the heroes are Ralph Adams Cram, who was the most famous architect in the country at the time, and a little-known Canadian Anglican priest named Robert Thomas Nicol. There you go. That's my tease.
Okay, well, that's a good tease. I've been fascinated with the Jacobites for I'd say going on 7 years now. So that'll be great, and I hope when that comes out, we could talk to you again about what's in this book.
Have me back.
All
Absolutely.
right. Well, thank you so much, and I hope everything goes well, and look forward to reading that book.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate
All
it.
right, appreciate it.